I scratched myself this weekend. Went to the corner drugstore, picked up some Band-Aids. You can barely see it. No big deal. Of course, to me, it's not a big deal. That's something that I can take for granted, that I can simply walk into the corner store and pick up a bandage that is so close to my skin color that you can barely see it. Not everyone has that privilege. There's this story that goes, once upon a time there were these two little fish swimming along in the ocean, and this one older, bigger fish came by, looks to them and says, "Hello boys, how's the water?" Two little fish keep on swimming, and then one turns to the other and says, "Water? What's water?" The story has been used as an illustration about privilege, about how it's the water that we swim in and so we don't even see it. Things like being able to go to the store and get a Band-Aid, or buy dolls for your little girl that look like her, turn on TV, see people who look like you. If you've never read it, there's a pretty famous reading about this called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. We'll put up a link for it later. It's one you're going to want to read. The word privilege refers to a benefit that not everyone receives, and it can be used in many different contexts. For example, for me, I had the privilege of attending a multicultural seminary. The majority of my classmates were African American, and so I got to learn about the National Baptist and the AME traditions in a way that I wouldn't have at perhaps another seminary. Another privilege that I had while I was at seminary is that I got to take this great class called The Ethics of Social Witness, MLK, and it was all about the ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. And indeed, he did see it as a ministry. He was a very religious man, and he wrote and spoke extensively about his religious beliefs. For instance, he said, "It so happens that I have a deep faith, an abiding faith in a personal God." He went on to describe that. Not some Aristotelian unmoved mover who merely contemplates upon himself. Not only a self-knowing God, but an ever-loving God who is concerned about the affairs of history. It is my conviction that God works through history for the salvation of man, and there is something in the universe that works for the molding of justice and goodwill and freedom. And he worked to live out his theology. In Letter from a Birmingham Jail, King laid out what he felt were the 4 steps for any nonviolent campaign. First, collection of the facts to discover if there is injustice going on. Second, negotiation. Third, self-purification. And fourth, direct action. Some of those you might have guessed, but what about self-purification? Self-purification was the term that King used to talk about the discipline that they did before they embarked on any action. When you think about the Freedom Riders, or sitting at lunch counters, or the marches, it may seem to you that that was something where they just kind of got the details together, girded up their courage, and went out and did it. But that's not true. There was actually a lot of role-playing, a lot of teaching, and a lot of introspection. And this was a spiritual exercise. They would practice and they would role-play and they would ask themselves, do I have what it takes to do this? To not strike back if someone hits me? Do I have the courage to see this through? As King wrote, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to accept the ordeal of going to jail? Our theme this month is salvation. And on salvation, King wrote, human salvation is in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. He believed that, yes, God worked through the history of human events to bring about justice, but the way that that happened was through our hands and our actions. King felt that salvation came through people who could not and would not reconcile themselves to things being, well, just the way that they are, that they were creatively maladjusted and would not adjust themselves to that reality. Human salvation, therefore, lies in the hands of people like you and me. People who will do those 4 steps of examining to see where there is injustice, examining to see where our own privilege lies, negotiating, self-purification, and taking action. Things are better than they were in King's Day, of course, but there are whole areas where desegregation has been merely a band-aid onto the reality that we know today. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech at Grosse Pointe High School on what he called the other America. And he laid out the reality of that time, that there were 2 different realities. One where you were economically strong, probably white, able to get a good education, and one where none of those things happened. In that speech, he talked about the fact that there were 2 different unemployment rates, one for people who were white and one extremely higher for those who were black. He pointed out that often African Americans at that time had perhaps a 9th grade education. That was 1968. In November 2012, just 2 months ago, unemployment in the U.S. dropped to 7.9%. In the African American community, it rose to 14.3%. Across the country, we are failing at educating our children, especially those who are non-Anglo. In my own town, in Houston, in our inner city schools, the majority of incoming freshmen will not graduate. Right now, 51% of incoming 9th graders will not graduate. To keep the dream alive, we must be creatively maladjusted to these realities. We must be willing to see the different privileges that exist and unwilling to accept them. As King famously said, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured. Salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Come, won't you be maladjusted with me?